Go sit down.
What story do you tell yourself about God? I mean, how do you imagine God? What is your relationship like with God? When you think about your story and God's story intersecting, what does it look like for you? How do you describe the character of God? Maybe you're not even sure you have a relationship with God. Maybe you feel like it's a one-way kind of thing instead of a reciprocal kind of relationship. But whatever it is, wherever you find yourself in a life of faith, ask yourself that question. What is the story you tell yourself about God? Now maybe, just maybe, the first two slaves in today's story would describe God, if they were asked, as gracious and generous, trustworthy even, faithful, loving. Maybe they would describe God as their rock, their provider, someone who loves them and takes care of them. They respond to what the master gives them seemingly in utter trust. They come back with double what they were given. The master says, "Enter into my joy," and we all did the Snoopy dance, right? Now, if we take that same logic and wonder then how the third slave might describe God, if in fact the master in the story is God, then maybe the third slave would describe the master as harsh and ruthless, taking from where he had not sown. And then, of course, the master responds, not "Enter into my joy, third slave," but in a ruthless manner, and kicks the third slave out. So maybe this is how that third slave would describe God. So really, the point of my sermon is what you see is what you get. Amen, right? Oh, no. So I don't think God is the master in this story. I think that Jesus tells this story about a landowner who owns land. And Jesus tells the story, who knows for what reason, but to illustrate what it's like to follow Jesus, right? What it's like to believe in God. So, and sometimes following God, following Jesus out into the world is risky, right? It's risky. I'm a child of the 80s, I couldn't resist. So we could think of the first two slaves as doing something incredibly risky, right? They took a very generous gift given to them by their master, and they increased it doubly. Now, what they were given was called a talent. And what that means, what that equals, 1 talent equals 15 years of wages. Okay? So they were given an obscene amount. It actually was silver. All at once. Obscene amount of money. And they took it all and they increased it all, and they made a lot of money for their master, and potentially they made some for themselves on the side. So then we can look at that third darn slave, way to go guys, and we can say, well, come on, you had this opportunity. I guess you are lazy and maybe ruled by fear, you might think. So cue the weeping and gnashing of teeth, right? So obviously of these 3 slaves, one of them is not like the others. The first 2 seem to be models of faith, lifted up as an example of receiving graciousness from the Lord and giving back, right? And now is when I would say, here's our stewardship campaign, and you need to be like the first 2 slaves and not like the third, right? But what if? You see, parables are for what if. What if that third slave, the one I really do like to think was operating out of faithlessness and fear, what if that third slave was operating out of great faith? What if it took incredible faith? What if that third slave, what if you viewed that third slave as a whistleblower, as someone that was blowing the whistle on a corrupt landowner. What if it took incredibly risky faith for that third slave to say no to a system that would certainly just mow him over without looking back? Now, the way that the economy was organized in the ancient world, well, this household in that economy would have been part of the elite class, okay? So that landowner, this is not an aw shucks 1950s farmer, right? Yeah, this landowner not only owned all this land that they lived on, but land far away, and was part of this. If this landowner was part of this elite class, then he was dependent upon a staff that would help him keep that elite staff, right, or elite status. So how he managed his affairs impacted not only his own stuff, but also the kingdom surrounding him, the cities of that kingdom. Political influence, all kinds of power came from this elite landowner. So, he would have to travel to oversee places that he owned other places, right? He'd have to go and check up on them. And then, in order to stay in that elite category, he would have to get more land. So it was so important that this landowner had a staff he could trust, not just with, mowing the lawn and washing the dishes, right? But with huge amounts of money, so that the elite status could be kept. Now, the majority of the landscape of first century Palestine was peasant class. Like, it was the people who were scraping by just to eat every day. So the wheeling and dealing of the elite class was done at the expense of the poor for the profit of the rich. So in a nutshell, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Does this sound familiar at all? That Bible, it's so disconnected, isn't it? So what if that third slave was putting his own status? He had a place in that elite household. He was well taken care of, right? What if he put his 1% status and instead acted on behalf of the peasant class, right? The 99%, those who were at the bottom of the system. What if Jesus was saying to his hearers, be like the third slave, be thrown out for the sake of others? Man, that's risky faith. Of course, we don't know the motivation for why Jesus tells this parable. But I love how muddy the categories get when Jesus opens his mouth. And he starts to tell stories to connect to our lives and what it means to follow him. Things get really blurry really fast. Now, certainly, you can assign clear-cut categories in the story, and you can come up with some good morals about money and responsibility. But this parable doesn't seem to be saying that. I think it matters. I think it really matters what story it is that you tell yourself about God, where you see yourself in that story, of God's story and our story, which we say every week, right? Because how you view God as interacting in your life impacts the rest of your life. It colors how you react to bad news, how you appreciate good and generous things in your life. It impacts how you interact with coworkers and friends and neighbors. It impacts how you treat strangers and people that are not like you. Now, if you think that God only decides the end of football games or the ringing bell on Wall Street, that's a really particular thing that you are thinking God does, right? Now, the third slave seems to know that a faithful Jew at the time, which is what Jesus was, right? He was a faithful Jewish man. If he was reading his scripture, he knew that you don't make money off of money. That was clear in those first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so for the master who's railing against him, you lazy slave, you could have at least put the talent in the bank and made some interest and given me my money back with some interest. When clearly there was a directive to faithful Jews that you don't make money just off of money, because you know what? It hurts people. It hurts other people that you can't see. Instead of using money to exchange with people that you can see, buying goods and services from people that it will benefit, right? So it seems ludicrous to us that the third slave buries that huge sum of money, even though he got less than the other 2. But yet it was a common practice back then, because it was a sign that he trusted that God was the creator, and that everything that comes from the earth is God's. So that was his way to hang on to that money and show it as a clear sign of who reigns in this story for him. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know what story you tell yourself about God, but there are days when my story, when I talk about God, is of a God who tolerates my fear and faithlessness. And other days, my story about God and my story connecting involve talking about how I think God has a wicked sense of humor and a really poor sense of timing. And some days God has a really great sense of timing. It just depends on the days sometimes. But even at the end of my most faithless days, at the end of the day, what I believe to be true about God's story and my story is that I believe in a God of love and a God that never stops reaching for me. And what I think is most important there for me is that love of God that's always reaching for me is not just for me, right? Is not just for me, but is for you, and is for strangers that we don't know, and people we've never met, and people we hate. That's who God's love is for. We are always being called into risky behavior when we are called to follow Jesus. It's never not risky. I'm not sure if you knew this, but you don't seem to be running for the door, so I'll take that as a good sign. It's risky stuff. And how you read this parable, you can see risk all through it. Maybe you see the risk as being caught up as another cog in the wheel and saying no in really hard situations. Maybe you see those first 2 slaves as taking great risks in doubling that money. I don't know how you see this story, but just know that there is a risk in following Jesus. And it's not a mistake that he asks us to risk it all to follow him. Because he always leads us, Jesus always leads us toward the stranger, toward the person we don't know, toward the person we don't like, toward the person we still have yet to forgive, toward the one who is in need of love and forgiveness or attention. Following Jesus is filled with risky behavior. And sometimes, wouldn't it be nice if we could just see some results, right, of following Jesus? Like bar graphs and pie charts and buildings constructed and balanced budgets and changed lives. Disciples are inspired by the Holy Spirit to take risks. It's one of our guiding principles. I would say it's the most dangerous one, but that's not true. They're all dangerous, right? It's a dangerous one. And I've seen your risky behavior as you reach out to people in public and in your own personal lives, taking risks of being hurt or thrown out like that third slave. And I'm so encouraged by knowing that I don't even see the half of it in your lives. I don't see how you take risks at your jobs or at school in the hallways, reaching out to kids that are shunned by lots of people. Just think of the ways that you take risks in the name of Jesus. By giving attention to that student that gets on every last one of your nerves, or giving attention to that teacher that you don't particularly care for, right? Or that impatient patient, or that coworker that you just can't believe you have to work with, right? Your story that you tell yourself of who God is in your life impacts all those relationships, impacts all those other stories that are then, of course, part of your story, right? At the end of the day, this God of love changes our lives, changes us from the inside out. And it's a risk worth taking, folks. It's a risk worth taking because it will rewrite your story day in and day out. And we say, thanks be to God.